The next group in the lineup is Grupo Etnográfico Pérolas do Atlântico de Casa dos Açores. And these are, this group represents the dancing and the costumes of the late 1800s in the Azores. And so each couple represents something different from the village, a different profession, a different role that they had in their village.
A seguir temos o grupo etnográfico Pérolas do Atlântico da Casa dos Açores, que representam as danças tradicionais dos Açores. Como veem, eles vêm vestidos com roupa tradicional, mas roupa diferente, e também com algumas ferramentas diferentes, porque era isso que eles faziam nos Açores naquela altura. Eu vejo ali o meu primo José Nelson com uma lata, ele deve ir ordenhar a cabra lá perto da sua casa, não é?
It's so important that we bring our children and young people to these events to remind them where their ancestors came from. We just returned from a trip to the Azores in Portugal and took 2 of our grandkids, and it was wonderful to see how they better appreciated their ancestors and where they lived and how life was for them. So this group represents that, reminds us of what life was like in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And in the Azores, life didn't change much for many decades.
A seguir ao grupo Pérolas do Atlântico, vimos dos táxis tradicionais das Ilhas dos Açores. Eu lembro-me da primeira vez que um táxi daqueles desceu à Feijão dos Vimes, deve ter sido mais ou menos em 1957 ou 58, mas até aquela altura não ia carros à Feijão dos Vimes. Eu sempre gostei muito daquela cor, não sei porquê, do preto e do verde. Aquilo é verde, não é? E agora a seguir temos vários animais, começando com os animais mais pequenos até chegar aos animais maiores.
We wanted to also take this opportunity to thank the hard work of everyone who is participating in preparing their costumes, preparing the floats, which has taken most of the summer. So many people behind the scenes that do the work so that we can enjoy this festival.
Nós queríamos agradecer a todos aqueles que trabalharam tanto para que este bolo de leite fosse o que é, e de uma maneira especial queremos realçar a importância dos vice-presidentes, porque é sempre a responsabilidade dos vice-presidentes em organizar este bolo de leite, o Sr. Manuel e Irma, ou Irmelinda Ornelas. A eles muito gratos, e pedi uma grande salva de palmas para os vice-presidentes e para aqueles que ajudaram a organizar este bolo de leite.
The Vice Presidents Manuel and Irma Ornelas worked really hard to make sure that the floats represented the most important parts of our 50-year history and being authentic in the replicas of the original buildings.
Uma das coisas que nós ouvimos, e para aqueles que não conhecem, são os carros de bois a chiar. E para nós isto pode ser só apenas ruído, mas para quem nasceu e cresceu nos Açores, reconhecer de quem era o carro de bois pelo barulho que o carro fazia.
So it may just sound like noise that the carts are making, but this was important back in the Azorean villages because the ox did the work, did a lot of the labor in the fields, and people in the village did not have their cell phones, did not have telephones. They knew who was coming through the village by the sound of the cart, and so these sounds are purposeful.
And many people made their living sometimes just by having a pair of oxen. They would go and work the fields for other people, and that's one of the ways to make a living. Das pessoas, ou algumas das pessoas, faziam a sua vida com um par de bois. Eu sei que quando os meus irmãos mais velhos vieram aqui para a América, e ficou só o meu pai e eu, nós nessa altura empregávamos alguém que vinha do portal para a região dos vinhos para trabalhar as terras.
So many people not many, but some people in the village would, their livelihood was 2 ox that they would rent out to other villagers to work the field. So ox were important in the life of the village. And as you know, most of you have come from there, the village was about agriculture. Your work was around working the fields, growing the corn, to put food on the table, and that's what your life was.
Teve um senhor agora aqui que me veio dizer que ele é de São Brás, da Terceira, e ele disse: olha, estes carros de bois fazem-me lembrar quando eu tinha 7 anos e eu via estes carros de bois e as sebes carregados de cereais, carregados de muitas outras coisas, de milho, e as pessoas faziam a sua vida com estes carros de bois. Quase todas as famílias que tinham alguma coisa tinham um carro de bois que usavam para fazer a sua vida. Eu até lembro-me que o meu pai e a minha família, eles faziam vinho e trocavam o vinho por milho, e então o meu pai ia da Feijão dos Vinhos a pé para Rosais. Para aqueles que conhecem São Jorge, é uma distância grande, ia a pé um dia, ia trocar o milho, ou ia trocar o vinho por milho, e depois, dali a dias, lá ia um carro de bois que trazia o milho para a Feijão e levava o vinho para Rosais. Eu queria agradecer a estas pessoas que vêm aqui com os seus animais. Nós vimos os animais e dizemos: oh, isto é tudo muito bonito, mas uma das coisas que talvez não pensamos é que estes animais levam muito tempo para preparar. É preciso tomar conta deles, é preciso que eles sejam mansos, é preciso trabalhar bem com eles. Portanto, estamos muito gratos às pessoas que aqui vêm para nos mimosearem com estas lindas juntas de bois, com os animais, com as cabras, com qualquer animal que aqui vem para estar connosco.
We have quite a collection of carts here. I think this is one of the largest we've had. They're beautifully decorated. Many of them represent the different uses that the carts had in the village. You know, today we've got our fancy pickups, but in those days it was the cart that did everything, right? It was the workhorse along with the ox. We are so thankful to the many people, families that brought their oxen, that decorated their carts, and joined us in our festivities today. They certainly remind us of where we are from.
So I was saying a little bit, and this is I think an interesting story for those who don't speak Portuguese. I was born in São Jorge, and where I lived, it was probably about 15 to 20 miles from the other side of the island. My dad would raise grapes and make wine, and once a year he would walk the 20 miles to the other end of the aisle, trade the wine for corn, and a few days later, one of these carts would come back to our village with the corn and would take the wine to the other side. And my dad would make that trip in one day barefoot.
We think it's a big deal to walk 10,000 steps a day. Can you imagine walking 20 miles barefoot from one end of the island to the other to do this in order to support your family? So next we have a number of beautiful cows representing this valley. The Portuguese came to this valley at the turn of the century, most of them getting involved in the dairy business or some part of the agricultural world. Probably all of us have relatives that at one point in the late 1800s and 1900s came, were here for a while, and then returned to the Azores, having saved their money so that life could be a little bit easier on the islands. The Portuguese are an important part of the dairy industry in the state. In those early days in the late 1800s, dairies averaged 30 cows. A 30-cow dairy was a large dairy. And nowadays, of course, it's very different, much more complicated to run a dairy with thousands of cows. So we have here Morgan Nunes, Alfred and Ali Nunes, Brianna Souza, Gabriel Souza, Michaela Silveira, Jackson Diaz, Elise Silva,